Test is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elena G. Levine. I'm president of Quantum Success Solutions and author of the book Networking for Nerds. And I am so excited about today's APS Student and Early Career webinar. As you know, we've been presenting a series this whole summer. We have another one planned for you. We're going to tell you about that in a moment. But today we've assembled an all-star team, an amazing panel to talk about something which I think we're all thinking about. It's all at the forefront of our brains. Online research, the tools and techniques. And we're going to actually talk about what are those tools and techniques, what do we mean by online research, how we can pursue our research endeavors using these different types of tools, how can we create collaborations. And I'm really interested to hear what the panel has to share about these topics. Now, of course, this is being recorded. As you know, you will get an email about where you can access this on the APS website. But if you have questions, we will be taking questions from you throughout the panel. So please post your question in the Q&A panel as part of your webinar console. Let us know what your questions are so we can answer as many as we possibly can in this hour together. So as you know, we have been giving a lot of these webinars this summer, and we have a really exciting one that's coming up as our finale, our grand finale in October. On October 15th, we're going to be doing one that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a STEM career consultant and professional speaker, as many of you know. And so we're going to talk about the path to postdoc. And we're going to hear from APS members, your friends, your colleagues, your peers, about how they were able to pursue their postdoc, how they were able to land their postdoc, and what they did to leverage their postdoc to make them even more successful and position them for triumph in their professional pathways. So it's going to be a really interesting one. And again, we'll be taking your questions for that one too. I also wanted to make you aware of a couple of really interesting programs that APS has. And I work with a lot of different STEM associations. And I got to say that what APS is doing in these areas is not only unique, but actually quite value driven. So I want you as a member of this community to think about taking advantage to leveraging these opportunities. The first one is a series of APS awards and honors. And you know what? I hear from a lot of particularly early career science and engineering professionals all the time who do not think to have them to nominate themselves or to ask their advisor or their colleague to nominate them or to nominate somebody else. This is your top time to shine. So I want you to consider potentially being nominated for or asking your advisor or to nominate you or considering even self-nominations of the, for example, APS Rising Star Award, which recognizes APS members who are early career. And so these are people like yourselves, psychological science nerds, which I know we are, who are trying to move and establish themselves as leaders in their field. I want you to be recognized. Consider being nominated, consider self-nominating, consider asking somebody to nominate you. And similarly, for those of us who are established in our careers, we could consider applying for the APS Mentor Award, which of course honors the significant contributions of people in your field, in your organization, in your communities who have contributed to the field of psychological science and to the professions. So think about those two awards. And the key about awards is that many people don't even consider applying for them. So I want you to get that competitive advantage. And the last thing that I wanted to share with you that APS does, which is really unique and so invaluable, quite frankly, for your career, is that APS offers small grants to support teaching and learning of various aspects of psychological science. Everything from scholarships of learning and tracking and teaching and learning, which allows you to, it supports high quality, potentially publishable scholarship directed at the teaching and learning of psychological science. There's a small grant to support meeting and conferences. There's other small grants, as you see, about curriculum and websites. Take advantage of this. The deadline to apply for all of these is October 1st, and the website is, of course, psychologicalscience.org/small-grants. So with that, I want to introduce our amazing panel today. So first, I'd like to welcome Robert Ariel, who is a PhD, of course. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Virginia Wesleyan University. I'd like to also welcome Dr. Elise Rice, who is the program officer for Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, for the Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Program at the NIH NIDCR. And of course, please welcome Joshua Van Arsdale, who's also a PhD. Elise is as well, as I mentioned. Joshua is an assistant professor of psychology at Elmhurst University. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to start before, now, just so the audience knows, each of our team members is going to give a short presentation about different aspects of online research and techniques, tools, and so forth. But before we begin, I'd like to ask each of the panelists if you could just sort of give us an overview, a quick summary of your career journey, the kind of work that you're doing right now. And when you think about online research and what you're going to be talking about, what do we mean by online research? And Robert, why don't we start with you, please?
Great, thank you. So as you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in psychology at Virginia Wesleyan University. I am a cognitive psychologist, and my research program focuses on metacognition, self-regulated learning, and applications of cognitive psychology to education. Before coming to Virginia Wesleyan, I was completing a postdoc at Purdue University. Before that, I was completing another postdoc at Georgia Tech. And prior to that, I was in a PhD program at Kent State University. When I think about online research as an experimental psychologist, I think of it as experiments conducted online, in your web browser. At least that's how I've approached it. And today, what I'm going to talk about is methods and tools for conducting online studies, like those studies in your web browser.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. And I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. I can't wait to see what you have to say and hear it as well. Dr. Rice, Elise, could you tell us a little bit about your career journey and what you're going to be speaking about today, please?
Yeah, certainly. So my name is Elise Rice. My PhD is in social psychology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I was trained in what I would call relatively basic social psychology. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my career, I felt myself increasingly drawn in the direction of thinking about the health applications of the fundamental processes that I was studying. And that led me to take a postdoc actually at the National Institutes of Health in the National Cancer Institute, their behavioral research program, thinking about cancer-related health behaviors and how psychological science and social psychology and affective science could inform research and eventually interventions related to cancer-related health behaviors. That took me to a place that I didn't really anticipate, but I found that I had a passion for science administration and enjoyed the funding agency environment and the challenges and opportunities that kind of work entailed. And so I decided to stay at NIH beyond my postdoc and took a position at NIDCR, which is the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. And I'm happy to chat more broadly about that. But when I think of online research and for the purposes of this discussion, I'm thinking anything under the sun that is in some way online, whether it's collecting data online or studying processes that happen online or secondary analysis of data that someone else has collected and those data live online now. So my presentation about funding considerations relevant to online research will kind of cover that variety.
Fantastic. Thanks, Elise. I think that's going to be really valuable for the audience to hear about that, particularly since we always are thinking about funding issues as it relates to research. Thanks so much. And Joshua, can you tell us a little bit about your career journey and what you're going to be speaking about today, please?
Sure thing. So yes, I'm Josh Van Arsdal. I am currently at Elmhurst University in the suburbs of Chicago area. Before this, I was at Kenyon College in Ohio. And then before that, I was finishing my PhD at Purdue University. My interests are primarily as a cognitive psychologist. That's my training. And however, I see myself sort of as primarily interested in this sort of intersection of cognitive psychology and memory and social cognition, and studying a lot of sort of basic social cognitive processes, especially those having to do with memory. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really sort of my sort of training in graduate school in terms of doing online research was a lot of what Robert talked about, around doing sort of the experiments through a browser window, that sort of direct participant interaction, using mTurk or other sorts of data sets like Qualtrics. But what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of trying to blow that up a little bit and think really rethinking research from the ground up in this sort of new environment. So this summer I've been doing a lot of data collection. It's new to me, but I'm trying to figure out how can I make this work in ways that are still useful, but that don't necessarily involve collecting data from participants or interacting with participants in a in a meaningful way. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how do we maybe rethink our research questions, and so that we can address them using things like content analysis and thematic analysis of data that's just out there in the world, say that's public information on the internet. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today.
This sounds really interesting, Josh. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you are going to speak about as well, because it's looking at the already available data, essentially.
Yeah, sorry, you're doing myself again. Yeah, so we're looking at things like Twitter, other sort of pieces of information that are publicly available, any sort of website that's just out there and meant for public consumption, whether that's tweets or things like Instagram or Facebook, anything that's out there and publicly available information. So
Fantastic.
that's the idea.
Thank you. Well, while Robert's getting ready for his talk, I just want to say, by the way, Joshua, it's just a little bit hard to hear you at times. So if you just keep that in mind, just to elevate your voice just a little bit, please. All right, with that in mind, Robert, we're going to you're going to take over now. Please talk to us a little bit about what we can think about in terms of tools and so forth. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is share with you methods and tools that I use in my lab for conducting studies online. What I'm going to talk about is how to conduct proctored experiments. Oops, what did I do? Sorry. How to conduct proctored experiments on the web with task software you already have, and how to develop and administer web-based tasks without a server or database. So let's say you want to collect data online, but you're used to collecting data in your lab, and the tasks that you administer in your lab require proctoring. So maybe you just don't think it would be potent enough without the experimenter present. What do? Or the second problem, let's say you use specialized software that's only available in your lab. So maybe all your tasks are programmed in software like ePrime that require you to run them on computers that are specifically licensed to run that software. How can you collect data with this software you already have and do something that approximates the in-lab experience? The solution is to use a tool that many of us who teach are becoming intimately familiar with, Zoom. So just like we're using to teach in a social distance manner, you could administer experiments in a socially distance manner using Zoom, but you can take advantage of a feature of Zoom that allows subjects to have remote access to your computer. So what this does is it allows subjects to complete tasks in software that's present on your computer without them being physically in the lab. It also allows you to administer proctored tasks because you're the experimenter there. You can answer questions in real time. You can see how the subject interacts with the software on your screen. And it's really simple to do this. All you need to do is load the software on your personal computer. So whether that be ePrime, I use a software called LiveCode that requires loading an executable file physically on your computer. You load that, you share your screen via Zoom, and then you grant the subject remote control to your computer on Zoom. So here are just some screenshots walking you through how to do this. First, if your settings aren't set up to allow remote control, edit those in your meeting basic settings. And it might be set to allow remote control by default, but if it's not, go click the setting. Next, just do like you would do if you were teaching. Share your screen with the subject. After you do that, click this remote control button in the top right corner. And then it's going to give you an option to select the subject. So in this case, I am Zooming with Ola. I would select Ola, and then Ola would have remote control my screen. So this would allow her to move the mouse, click buttons on my screen, and also type into text fields on my screen. So subjects can essentially complete tasks on your computer remotely. So I think this is the easiest solution to get up and running with software that you already have and tasks you already have programmed. And maybe this is the best approximation of the in-lab experience you're going to get virtually, because you have the experimenter there to proctor the task. You can administer sort of interventions over video to the subject. You can answer questions in real time. It really is the best approximation of the in-lab experience you're probably going to get. And it's free if you're doing a one-on-one session. So Zoom allows free one-on-one sessions up to 24 hours. Now, if you add a third participant to the session for whatever reason, then you are limited to 40 minutes. But note if you're doing this remote control, using the remote control feature, you can only do that with one subject at a time anyway, so you probably only want to do this one-on-one. And this works on both Windows and Mac, so you don't need to worry about that if your subject has a different operating system. A few cons with this approach: it's unclear how reliable the response time data are over Zoom. So I might be reluctant to collect data that requires precise measurement of response time. But that's an empirical question. We just don't know because it's a new method. And another con for me is that you can only collect data from one subject at a time using this remote control feature. So it's just much slower. So I'm used to collecting data from 4 to 8 people at a time, so you get data much faster. This is obviously much slower, but it's a good compromise if you still want to give subjects something that approximates the in-lab experience virtually. Next, I want to talk about what if you need to program your own tasks for the web. So we're going to talk about building browser-based experience. So this is maybe what people think about when they think about conducting experiments online with platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific. What may prevent people from doing this? A couple of roadblocks. Maybe you just think programming is too hard, or another roadblock typically is that you don't have a server and database. I'm going to talk about a free solution of both these problems that'll help you design tasks quickly and get up and running, collecting data on the web with new experiments that you build. And some of you may be familiar with these solutions. I highly recommend both these tools. In this case, free does not mean bad. I think that these are some of the best solutions for administering experimental tasks out there, and they're free. The solutions are jsPSYCH, which is a JavaScript-based library. This is created by Josh DeLue. He's just done a wonderful job creating an extensive library of pre-programmed experimental tasks, and just really nice documentation that makes it sort of easy to navigate through the website to sort of understand how jsPSYCH works. So you can download jsPSYCH from GitHub here, but it turns out you don't even need to download it anymore because you can use this brand new tool that was developed just a couple of months ago called Cognition.Run. This was developed by a software developer named Javier Pena, whose wife is a psychologist. And she, like all of us, had this problem where, we can't have subjects in our labs. How does she collect data? Needed a solution. So he developed this website that interfaces with jsPSYCH. It essentially takes all the jsPSYCH architecture and allows you to host experiments online and store your data online for free. So you don't need a server or a database. You can program your studies on Cognition.Run, and it'll generate a link for your task and automatically save your data. So let's just kind of quickly talk about how to do this and how to work with jsPSYCH to get you up and running quickly. To get started, just visit jspsych.org. And again, the documentation is really nice. So what you're going to want to do is just click on this plugin tab and just start learning about what pre-programmed plugins are already available for tasks. And I counted today, I think 39. So most of these plugins are going to accomplish most of the tasks that you may need to program your tasks. There are always new plugins being created, so if there's something not there, you can develop it. That's a little bit more intensive, but for most people, these plugins are going to solve the problems you need to solve. So there are things like this jsPSYCH audio button response. What that does is that is pre-programmed code to present audio file and allow the subject to click a button. There's this audio keyboard response. Same thing, you can present an audio stimulus and the subject can respond on the keyboard. There's a slider option for that. There are all sorts of other options like the jsPSYCH HTML button response, which is presenting text on the screen, subjects respond with a button. HTML keyboard response, presenting text on the screen, they respond with a keyboard response. So using all these plugins, you can easily build your task. So what you want to do is on the website, just go to the documentation for that plugin and look at the sample code. And again, the documentation is so nice and easy to navigate. When you go there, you get some information about what the plugin does, and then you get information about what parameters you can specify for the plugin. So in this case, you can specify what the stimulus is, what the key response choices are, what prompt there is, what the stimulus duration is, does the response end the trial. You get information about what data is automatically generated with this code, and then you get sample code. And the sample code is what we're going to utilize to build tasks on Cognition.Run. So this is actually all you need to do a simple presentation where you present words on a screen and subjects respond by pressing a keyword, a key on. And what I'm going to show you in a moment is just how to quickly build a paired associate learning task that involves presenting a fixation, presenting a word pair, and then having subjects make a judgment alerting. So we're just going to use these plugins to build a quick task that you can administer over the web. So to do that, what we need to do then is move over to cognition.run. We're just going to take that sample code we just looked at, create a free account in cognition.run, and when you do that, you can be prompted to build a new task, or you can clone an old task just to sort of practice with some tasks that are already pre-programmed with jsPSYCH. I created this demo program, though, that I'm going to show you really quickly. When you open a task, you get this scripting window, and you get a live preview of the task you're programming. So you can see in real time whether it's working. The code window will flag any code that's not working. Here, what I'm doing is just presenting a fixation for 2,000 milliseconds. And all I'm doing is using that HTML keyboard response that I just showed you, with the stimulus being a fixation. Now, there's a little bit of HTML here, so it helps to know a little bit of basic HTML. In most cases, I can often Google solutions when I'm having difficulty with HTML. But that's useful to have that knowledge. Specify the choices. In this case, I don't want any keyboard response, so I use this jspsych.yokeys function, and then I specify the trial duration, 2,000 milliseconds. So I'm going to present a stimulus for 2,000 milliseconds, and then I'm going to present word pairs for study. And again, I'm just using the same plugin to do that. I'm using the HTML keyboard response plugin. But this time, the stimulus, what I'm going to use is this jspsych.timeline variable word pairs. And I'm going to specify this below. And this code is something that I also just pulled from the jsPSYCH website. I mean, I'm not fluent in JavaScript. I have a very basic understanding of it. I've completed like the Code Academy course for JavaScript, and that's all the JavaScript knowledge I have. But I've always been able to get tasks to function correctly using this simple architecture. So here I'm just specifying a list, and I'm just saying I want it in a random order. And then jsPSYCH is going to randomly present those word pairs in that order. Following each study trial, I'm just to make this just a little bit more complicated, I wanted to show you another jsPSYCH plugin that I would present immediately after word pairs, and that's this HTML slider response plugin. So I'm just going to use this to have subjects make a competence judgment, or judgment alerting in this case. It just asks what is the likelihood that you'll remember the word pair you just studied. So I'm just using that slider response. So the sequence of trials is fixation, word pair, JOL. And all of the code you need to do this simple task is right here. Using, again, just the sample code I pulled from the website. And then importantly, this bottom portion, this jsPSYCH initiate code, where you specify the timeline. In this case, I'm just calling the variable PA learning, which stands for paired associate learning, which is what I just programmed here. If I had another variable or task that I programmed, I would just put a comma there and then call that next. So you can do multiple things sequentially. Paired associate learning test, I might follow that with a paired associate cube recall test. So I would just have that specified next in the timeline. And it's that simple to get up and running. In fact, I had some undergraduates programming their senior theses in jsPSYCH, in my last class, using this cognition.run. There are features to collaborate so they can share with you and you can help them out. But it's not that difficult, even though the code might look a little bit scary to you here. So after you are done in that scripting window, Cognition.run automatically generates a link for you. So you can take this link and you can share this on your participant recruitment platform, whether that's Sona or maybe mTurk or Prolific. You just need that link. And Cognition.run also saves the data here automatically to a database, and you can download that as a CSV file here. So just to summarize some of the pros and cons of this approach, while I think it's a flexible and free software solution for online data collection, it's a very powerful platform, and you can do basically anything you want with it, as long as you have sort of sufficient enough JavaScript knowledge. But with even basic knowledge, you can accomplish most experimental, you can program most experimental tasks. And as I mentioned, most plugins for tasks are already available. You don't need a server or database when you're using that cognition.run. And you can also collect data using this platform on Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific. But no, that's not free. And what I try to do here is emphasize free solutions because I just know budget's tight, but both of these are free. Cons, it does require basic JavaScript and HTML knowledge. And if you need to design your own plugin, it requires a bit more advanced JavaScript knowledge. But again, new plugins are always being developed. The community is great. So, if you design a new plugin, you can upload it. It could eventually become part of the jsPSYCH architecture. So I think Zoom is the easiest solution for administering tasks you already developed, and it's probably the best solution for mimicking the in-lab experience. And JSPSYCH and Cognition.run are really all you need to develop and collect data online for free. So I hope these tools are going to be useful to you all, and you can use them to get up and running, collecting data in your lab quickly online. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Robert. And I love that you, first of all, gave us solutions for those of us that are JavaScript not fluent, perhaps introductory or maybe slightly adjacent to advanced or moderate in our fluency of JavaScript. So thanks for doing that. And also to think about leveraging Zoom. Oh my goodness, it's ubiquitous right now. Now this brings to mind, we already got a question from an audience member. Somebody wants to know, actually a couple of people want to know about Zoom and security. So I wonder if you could just briefly address what are the security issues that you have to be thinking about? Is it possible that the other party could get access to your computer? Is there a security issue in that regard? How do you think about this, and what precautions should you take?
Oh, okay, so I mean, it's the concern. It sounds like the concern might be with giving them remote control to your computer, and
oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually easy to take it back. So as soon as you click your mouse, you can take remote control back. So if it looks like your subject is, attempting to access your private documents, you can immediately take back remote control just by clicking the mouse on clicking your mouse. So.
Good to know. All right,
Yeah.
so I use my mouse. All right, awesome. I love it. And before we introduce Joshua, I just want to remind you, this is being recorded. Several of you asked about this. You will be able to access this. We're going to send you an email about where to look for it. It will be on the Association of Psychological Sciences website. So that's www.psychologicalscience.org/webinars. But you will get an email from us telling you exactly where it is. With that, Josh, take it away.
Thanks so much. So just want to make sure you can see my screen just fine. Good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is, so what I've been doing in the past is this sort of Qualtrics or these other sorts of approaches that Robert was talking about. And I think that's excellent. I love this cognition.run idea. I'm going to tell that to a whole bunch of my students. But what I'm going to be talking about really is how do we rethink our sort of research questions maybe from the ground up to maybe still answer or at least investigate related questions, okay? So how can we do this with things that are publicly available, really? So what I think we really need to do, what we really need to start with, is we have to think back, really, what are we asking? What is the question that we're asking? So start from your first principles about what your topic area is, all right? So this really just requires you to make sure you know what you're studying, right? So if you're studying, the way, that gender dynamics in, in a classroom environment, that could be, I just completely made that up right now, but if that's what you're studying, then you need to think about, okay, well, what does that look like? What are my measurements? What are my operational definitions, right? So we can look at these sorts of questions in other sorts of environments that are not necessarily conducting a study in a lab setting, right? So what we could do is look how can we study these topics in the wild, right? As I'm kind of phrasing it here. So we need to be a little bit more creative about what we mean and how we're going to measure these different ideas. So if we're interested in studying gender in the classroom, right, then we can maybe expand our frame a little bit to think about how that might be represented in online content, right? So we might be able to look at, for example, Twitter and see people talking about their experiences in the classroom. And of course, we need to think about who are the people that are going to be talking on Twitter versus who people that aren't, these sorts of things. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we can do a lot of our same sort of, answer a lot of our same sort of questions using just the voices of people that are already talking about these issues, all right? So it might be difficult to study something like basic cognitive processes using this approach, but depending on what your topic area is, a lot of different content areas can definitely be approached. You just have to be creative about how you approach it using these sorts of data sets. So I like to think of this as sort of expanding the frame. So how do I measure my topic, right? And get creative a little bit with your operational definitions. So this might be in terms of frequency of certain sorts of hashtags, or maybe the co-occurrence of different words present in tweets. So you might search through tweets looking for the presence of, looking at the way that women are presenting themselves on Twitter and how they're talking about their classroom experiences, the way that men are presenting themselves on Twitter and talking about their classroom experiences. Or even if there, if there are differences in whether or not people even talk about their classroom experiences. So another important thing here is that because a lot of this research, what we're really doing here is descriptive and correlational. We're not doing an experiment, right? So we're just looking at things that are already out there in the world. We need to make sure that we are familiar with the relevant sorts of approaches. And there are lots of approaches, right? But two that I think are really relevant here are content analysis from a quantitative standpoint. So if you want to do things like count up the number of mentions that certain hashtags or word frequency occurs in different sorts of tweets, that would be a more quantitative approach, right? You could also look at the number of likes, the number of retweets, the number of followers a person has, and all of these sorts of things. I'm just using Twitter as an example here, right? To think about audience engagement, popularity, other sorts of metrics that might tell you something about the kinds of topics that might be things that people are engaging with. In terms of thematic analysis, this is a more qualitative approach, where what you're doing instead is trying to understand how does the individual perceive their own experiences, right? And how can you place it in the context of this larger project, right? So you might look at individual tweets and code them for things like, okay, this tweet is clearly expressing anger or frustration. This tweet is expressing gratitude towards an instructor. This tweet is expressing frustration with a classmate. And you can gather a whole bunch of tweets that are, again, publicly available and code them for things that might be of relevance to you. The one key thing to keep in mind here, though, is that there are ethical considerations involved with doing this sort of work. The data may be public. People are aren't protecting their tweets and are putting this out there for the world to see, right? But it's not you that gets to decide if your study is exempt. It's your IRB that gets to decide that. So you should definitely still be putting together IRB proposals, and you'll just be sending it off to the IRB. And assuming you're only looking at public data, they will probably give you a nice check saying, okay, you're looking at things that people are not protecting. There's this assumption of being in the public domain on these sorts of websites, things like Twitter, certain parts of Facebook, things like Reddit, et cetera, right? That the point is to be social, that you can gain more followers, right? So this is easy work from that perspective. You still have to do the work of putting together an IRB proposal, but as long as you aren't contacting people, you're just collecting data and looking at tweets, looking at patterns, et cetera. This can be very easy research to do from that perspective. The careful thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is, so this is from anthropology. I like to keep this in mind. It's called an emic versus an etic approach. So this idea of making sure that what you're studying, you're keeping the perspective of the person who's doing the tweeting or doing the posting or whatever it is in mind as you're doing this work. So you don't want to speak for these people, especially if you're doing these sorts of thematic analysis where you're trying to place their thoughts, their comments in a broader context. You don't want to misrepresent what they're saying. So that's this idea of an emic approach. We want to understand things from their perspective, right? Whereas this other sort of approach, etic approach, is this idea of maybe we can count up the number of retweets and study this from a more scientific sort of standpoint. So that really depends on what your research question is, what you're interested in. Are you interested in these more sort of qualitative aspects of experience, or are you maybe interested in more of these quantitative components, things like engagement with followers, things like the frequencies of a hashtag, or whatever it is that you're looking for. Okay. Okay. So some different public content sources. I think Twitter is an excellent one. It has this expectation of being public. It's very similar to a sort of conversation, but it's also sort of a discussion board format, depending on how you look at the retweets and the sort of threads that occur there. It also has metrics sort of built into it for you, things like likes and retweets and comments that are easy to parse, at least in that regard. The disadvantages for Twitter are that it requires a lot of hand coding if you don't want to pay through the nose for some of their special API software. which is not necessarily hard to do if you have several folks doing the hand coding. It also has some pretty powerful search tools and that are free that I can show you here in a moment that we can look at. Other sorts of sources include things like Instagram. You can view Instagram through a web browser. It's not only an app. So this is something that you can also look at on a computer, and you can look at if you're interested in especially things like the way people advertise themselves, the way that people are communicating messages about appearance, about if you're interested in things like gender dynamics, if you're interested in social psychology in particular is very ripe for studying things on these social media platforms. But you could also be looking at more basic sorts of processes as well. You just might have to be a little creative about how you define what you're looking for there, and keep that in mind. Other things include Reddit. Again, things are public, and for many of these subreddits, and you can just go to them, read them, and see what the conversation is like about a particular topic area. And then finally, Facebook. Facebook is probably the strangest one out of these because a lot of it is people do protect things that they post. Some people don't, but it's I think the hardest to interact with in a way that's scientific, honestly, because Facebook is very specifically trying to control the way that they're presenting information to you. So it's difficult to do things like figure out, well, how am I randomly searching for content about this particular area, that kind of thing, okay? So one other component to think about here, no matter what you're studying, right, these are just some examples of social media platforms, you could do this in other places too. So you could find, for example, a blog and code it for the ways that people are discussing certain topics. I have a colleague who is studying parenting, and she studies mommy blogs. So these blogs where women talk about their experiences parenting and coding them for different sorts of affective measurements, as well as other ways of how do they talk about parenting? What are the sort of terms and phrases and approaches that they use, right? So that's just another sort of way to do this. But again, the thing that you have to keep in mind for all of this work is that you're only seeing what people are presenting to you, right? So it's interesting, and I think it's very useful to at least get a sort of first glance at a topic area, or depending on how you look at it, you can even get some pretty detailed metrics here. But it is only what people put out into the world, right? So you have to keep that in mind in terms of things like a volunteer bias. There are problems with, who are the people who are doing the tweeting versus who aren't, etc. In terms of Twitter, this is the one I'm the most familiar with anyway. There's some pretty powerful search tools. This is called search syntax. So I recommend, like Robert was saying, definitely Google, like, how do I search for this on Twitter? And there's lots of documentation out there for how to do that. There's advanced searches here, so you can look for tweets with certain words or certain phrases, none of these words, hashtags, certain languages. You can even do things, there's other advanced syntax where you can look for tweets from within a certain radius of a certain geolocation to see how people are having conversations about certain topics in certain areas. So the key thing that I mentioned earlier, right, is how is this data coming to you? This is what you really have to keep in mind. So one important thing is random sampling possible for some of these websites? The answer is no. They have an algorithm that's presenting data to you in a particular fashion, right? So you have to be careful about thinking about how that's going about. With Twitter, I found that the easiest way to do this is what I was looking at comparing tweets in Chicago versus Houston for a project of the summer, comparing the impact of different COVID-19 policies in these different areas. And what we found was that if you just look for a search term and then within that geolocation, it comes up with it's just organized by time. So you find the most recent ones and it goes backwards. So you can pretty easily develop a way of, it's fairly random, it's based on who tweeted it at that certain moment in time. And you can look backwards to find tweets or profiles that match your criteria for the kinds of things that you're looking for to study. And then I also just recommend that try to make links to other relevant public data. So for example, I mentioned in the study that I talked about just a moment ago, we were looking at location, right? So you can look at things like historical crime rates and other publicly available information, weather data by location, whatever your question is, right? There's often a lot of publicly available sources out there about that thing by location, right? Also, additionally, you might look at things like laws and policies. So, if there are certain sorts of policies by state or by city, I'm giving COVID-19 sort of quarantine procedures as an example, but you could do this for anything, right? Let's say you're studying, I don't know, police community relations, and maybe we could look at different sorts of policies in the community and comparing that with the way that people talk about the police in that community on Twitter, just as an example. Another one to keep in mind is something like contingencies or time. So when are tweets posted? Are they posted during the day, only at night? Are they posted in response to something? So you might look at an event that happens in the world and then look at the tweets that follow that event to see, how are they commenting? What is this in response to exactly? So keep in mind sort of context. The broader context is really important because that's what these websites are really all about, is people commenting on the context of their lives in many ways. So my bottom line here is to really just be creative in how you're thinking about your research questions, because you can probably measure it or think about it in a way that's useful to you. It just may not be the typical way that you would have conceptualized it or thought of it to begin with. Okay. Great. So that's all for me.
Thanks. Thank you, Josh. I liked how you walked us through how to use these different sites in a very effective way. Somebody asked a great question about demographics. To what extent are reliable and valid descriptive statistics available about a platform's demographics, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook?
Sure. I think that would really depend on what sorts of topics you're looking at, right? So I would always try to keep in mind what is the population that you're trying to reach or trying to study when you're looking at something like Twitter or Instagram, et cetera, because you're not going to probably get a representative sample of like the US at large necessarily, unless you're looking at just tweets within the US, right? I don't know. There's probably some research out there, I would guess, about the demographics of Twitter users, for example. I don't know it off the top of my head. The project I was working on was looking at a particular slice of the demographic, so we weren't as concerned about those issues, but it's definitely an issue to consider. You can think about also who has a smartphone, who has a computer that's able to access these sorts of things in terms of accessibility, et cetera. So if you're interested in studying populations that may not have access to these tools, then you're probably not going to be able to study them as effectively, potentially. Yeah, excellent question.
Good, and good tip to remember. Okay, Elise, looking forward to hearing what you have to say, please.
Sure, great. Well, so as I mentioned before, I'm a program officer at the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. I'm the Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Branch. And that's not a place I ever expected to find myself working alongside dentists when I was getting my degree in psychology, but here I am. It's an interesting place. And my disclaimer is that I'm going to speak about funding considerations for online research that are fairly high level and cover a wide variety of methodologies, of topics that you might be interested in. This presentation is fairly specific to NIH. Of course, there are many funding agencies and organizations beyond NIH that might have different policies. But I hope that some of the general principles that I'm going to speak to will still be relevant wherever you may seek funding. And my kind of bottom line, which I'll say again and again, is to always contact your program officer. So someone like me, whether at NIBCR, some other institute within NIH, or a foundation of any private organization that offers funding, someone who's in a role to help you understand either the technical aspects of applying for and managing funding from the organization, and who also has the scientific expertise to understand what you're doing and help you align your research plans with the priorities of the organization. So with that kind of disclaimer underway, I think another kind of short answer, aside from contact the program officer, another short answer for what are the funding implications of doing online research is that it just kind of depends on what you have in mind, but the consequences or considerations of doing online research maybe aren't as different from doing in-person research as you might expect. So I will say at the NIH at least, training, fellowship, and career development awards, the application process for proposing research in those kinds of mechanisms is a bit broader. It's a little less focused on all of the exact details of the actual research plan for the work that you're wanting to do. And so, of course, talk with the program officer, make sure online research in whatever form you have in mind is within the scope of the award. But I think whether you're doing research in person, online, using data that are already available out on the internet somewhere waiting to be collected, it's probably more a matter of finding the appropriate funding opportunity that matches your career level and what you're looking for. So I'm going to focus instead on what we call research project grants, things like R grants. You may have heard of R01s or R21s. These also might have U acronyms as well. But in these applications, there's more focus on the specific details of the research. And so you might be wondering how using online methods in one form or another might shape your application. So I think the first relevant question is really, even before you begin writing your application, about selecting the funding opportunity that makes the most sense given the research that you want to do. So are your topic and the methods that you're proposing within the scope of that funding opportunity? So depending on the scientific focus and scope, some FOAs may specifically call for certain types of research or roll out other types of research. It may be the case that online or maybe a mobile aspect is actually the topic of your research, in which case you might find specific funding opportunities that support topics like mHealth or telehealth research, social media or social networking, or mobile app-based interventions. So these are all areas in which the NIH has expanding interests that have been certainly amplified by the current circumstances of the pandemic. But regardless of what your topic is, maybe the online aspect is just a tool that enables you to conduct research, on any topic with greater efficiency or on a larger scale. And in that case, you might find a funding opportunity that's specific to your topic, whatever it may be, or you could apply to a very general funding opportunity announcement, just as you would with research using in-person methods. So once you've identified the appropriate funding opportunity announcement, of course, that's something that the program officer would be more than happy to help you do. There's the questions that you consider as you're developing your application and anticipating how it will fare in scientific peer review. And a lot of this comes down to some of the kind of basic principles that Josh addressed in his presentation, and thinking about, are you asking innovative questions and planning a rigorous study to answer them. And so again, I would just say, kind of at whatever stage you are, and certainly the earlier the better, connect with a program officer to make sure that your plans are aligning with the technical limitations of any funding opportunity you're interested in, and also the scientific priorities of the agency. So in the case of secondary data analysis, where kind of beyond the case of the data are out there to be observed or compiled. It could even be the case that there's a database that's publicly available and just waiting for someone to analyze it. You might encounter different funding mechanisms, which is not to say that some other funding mechanisms might also apply if you're doing primary data collection. But still, I think the principles largely remain the same. So unless the secondary data analysis that you have in mind is packaged with other activities, your work may be more likely to fit the scale of smaller grant mechanisms, something like an R03 or an R21, because of course, if what you have in mind is actually using data that already exists, may have even already been collected, then you don't need to budget the time or the money, all of those precious resources for data collection. You can get going with your analysis, and so the scope of the grant just may be smaller. And then again, once you've identified the appropriate mechanism with the help of your program officer, there's the question of are your analyses and inferences that you're planning to make on the basis of these data, are those scientifically sound? So thinking about this slightly different perspective of working within whatever constraints are imposed by either the platform you're using or the data set that you're going to be accessing. How can you work within those parameters to do rigorous research that's going to yield compelling insights? And I think especially if someone else designed the study or they collected the data, it can be challenging to obtain compelling answers to your research questions because you don't have the flexibility to kind of create whatever parameters or methods that you would if you were kind of starting on your own research project. But of course, there are tremendous benefits to being able to analyze existing data when appropriate. I think some things I would caution should be don't let yourself get carried away. I think sometimes investigators can fall a little too deeply into like sales pitch mode or get a little drunk on statistical power with large sample sizes and propose testing questions that the existing data just can't address in a rigorous way. But certainly, be humble about the limitations and the value of the data that you're working with. And as always, talk to a program officer. So I think I'll leave it there, and maybe we can take more questions.
Thanks, Elise. And I'm so glad you mentioned about essentially the collaboration that researchers have with their program officers, with the POs. You have a stake in my research. You want to help me succeed, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a primary part of our job, and one of the more fun parts of our jobs is speaking with researchers who are excited and trying to figure out the best way to bring their cool ideas into the world.
And to relate to that, if I have a challenge as a researcher, if I have a challenge producing my research, conducting my research, or solving the research problems that I had outlined in my grant, given new parameters like the pandemic, you're my colleague. I can go to you and I can say, this is where I am. What can I do? How can I think about this? And that's part of the service essentially that you provide. So I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially within the context of an agency as complex as NIH, which released a handful of flexibilities that could be extended to investigators related to the disruptions caused by the pandemic. It's our job to be attuned to those and make sure that investigators know what options that they have.
Yes, thanks, Elise. I just want to make an announcement. So we're getting close to the hour. However, we still have some questions coming in. I just wanted to check with the panel to make sure, would it be okay for all of you to just stay for another 5 minutes after the hour? Okay, sure. Fantastic. Thank you. All right, because we got a great question. We got a few great questions, but the first one actually is for Elise. Are there issues with reviewers not valuing online research versus in person?
That's a great question. I think that's a perpetual concern, especially for researchers who are trying to do online work. I remember even in like the early days of MTurk trying to understand what is the trade-off. Is it going to be taken seriously? Do people, are there concerns about the, the validity of the responses I'm getting? And I think those are always important points to address in an application. I'm less concerned about kind of across the board devaluing of online research. I think it's at this point, fairly well established and appreciated, at least among psychologists, and maybe also behavioral and social scientists more broadly even. And so that would encompass the likely pool of reviewers for an NIH application. I think the salient considerations are to focus more on the specific limitations that are particular to whatever your methods are. But I wouldn't be so concerned about maybe a general sense that online research is less than in a kind of blanket way.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. So this next question is for everybody. What are some approaches to ensure better quality data from online studies? For example, identifying those participants who are not paying attention. Not like any of our attendees today at our webinar, of course.
I guess I can go ahead and start. So, I mean, it's common often to include attention checks and just certain questions to, make sure that your subjects are who they say they are. So what's becoming more popular are also like cultural checks. So you just ask questions where people from different cultures are likely to respond in different ways. So maybe they have a different word for an object than is typical in English-speaking US countries and in other countries. So you can use all those kind of methods. Though I think in general, the concern about online subjects being less attentive than in-lab subjects is not really supported by the data. So like there's research comparing MTurk subjects to in-lab subjects, and they do just as well on attention checks. And in some cases, researchers have concluded that they're maybe even more attentive than people in the lab. So I think we kind of are more concerned about that than we maybe need to be. But you can use certain attention checks and things like that in your tasks if you are concerned.
Something I always do also is at the very end of the study, just give them an opportunity just to tell you if they were paying attention or not. And that does a really good job of, I think, getting people to be honest, and you can just nicely cut those folks out of the analysis.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question comes in, how do you minimize, and this is for everybody, how do you minimize the lack of experimental control associated with allowing participants to run tasks in their own home? I'm wondering that myself, actually.
Well, I guess the Zoom method minimizes that, right? So you can actually observe the subject. Of course, they could be off staring on other screens, and you don't have control over that. But if you have your camera up, you do have a sense of where they're looking. And if you're monitoring your own screen, you know that they're at least interacting with your screen. And you can get a sense of the noise levels and things like that. Something I always include in my online studies, though, that aren't proctored is just a brief environmental survey where I just ask them about how loud their environment was, whether they're distracted, get some basic information about the type of equipment they're using. That way you can just statistically control for it. Yeah.
Thanks. Josh, Elise? Okay, no problem. You echo what he says. I agree with Robert. So I have another question for you, Robert, about IRB issues. So are there IRB issues with one-to-one Zoom because you are seeing what they respond to as an individual? Or how does IRB work with Zoom exactly?
I don't think that, we haven't had any problems with IRB here because the task is functionally very similar. So if they were in the lab, they might have an experimenter sitting behind them, watching them perform the task on their screen. Now the only difference is you're watching them perform it on your screen. So it's functionally not that much different. So there hasn't really been any pushback from our IRB. Though every IRB is different though. So maybe somebody else can chime in about that, or any concerns they might think would come up with it.
Elise, Josh? Any other points about that?
Yeah, I think one thing you might want to address in your application is maybe around the nature of it being, I could see an IB saying that it might be coercive, that you're watching them to do it that way. But I think if you're just very upfront about it as being, like saying the things that you said, Robert, about this is what typically happens in the lab, this is typical practice, then I think you might cut those fears off.
Yeah, you certainly need to disclose that. And if you are using like the recording functions in Zoom, then that's something that certainly needs to be disclosed to IRB, because then there are issues with, confidentiality and another sorts of data that you have to sort of deal with because you have video recordings of the subjects. But yeah, disclosing it to your IRB.
Excellent. So we got a question, before I ask the last question, I just want to ask you this one about the issues associated with using the online approaches with phone versus computer. So if I am doing a Zoom task, but I'm doing it via my phone, is there an issue with that, or is it the same scenario, same parameters?
I'm not sure. I guess it's going to depend on the software you're programming it in. In the past, I've used, with jsPSYCH, I've used specific code to not allow people that are using mobile devices to take the task. So if I'm doing a study on mTurk, they have to do it on a computer or a laptop. But that's a little bit more advanced than what we talked about today. But I specifically try to prevent that from happening, because I'm just not sure how the information is going to display on their screen. So you would have to test it out after you design the task, see what it looks like, see if it's still reasonable for them to interact with it. I prefer, though, my task to be done at a computer with, mouse and keyboard, especially if you're getting, key press responses and things like that. You just need them to have access to an actual computer to do the task.
Sure. So you don't want me to send in a fax or use Pigeon, for example, to submit my data. Okay, good to know.
A related question.
Oh yeah,
just
please.
Robert, really quickly, do you know can you do remote control in the browser version of Zoom, or do they have to have Zoom installed on their computer?
I do it in the browser, so I don't think they need to have it installed.
Okay, that would be useful to know, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because the students I interact with are all now really familiar with Zoom. So, we have no problem setting up the calls and then going to the remote share. It works pretty seamlessly because everybody's just used to it now because it's a new normal.
Oh, you mean it works Zoomlessly, right? No, I'm sorry, I had to do that. Sorry. Terrible. All right, but we're not going to end on that note. We're going to end on a really high note. This is my last question for the whole team before we conclude for today, and this actually came in. So I was wondering if each of you could give like a 30-second summary sort of the ethical concerns associated with online research. And Elise, if you don't mind, why don't we start with you? What do you think about in terms of ethical issues with online research?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's in a nutshell. I guess I would say I think it's going to vary from study to study, right? In some cases, just depending on your methods, there might not really be additional ethical considerations beyond the kind of standard precautions and protections that you consider with in-person research. I think, especially when we think about video recording, which can be done in person anyway, and other maybe more intensive modes of data collection, or of course, if we're talking about sensitive information, there's maybe some added caution, and then there are always questions of data security and things like that. But I think it just requires a lot of thoughtfulness up front. Of course, being attuned to the specifics of your home IRB and being a careful researcher.
Thank you. Great way to end it. Josh, 30 seconds. What do you think about ethics in terms of online research?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of what I was talking about before, so technically all of the data is publicly available, right? It's all just posted out there in the world for anyone to interact with it on Twitter, assuming that they have a public account. That being said, I think we need to be really careful, even still, about two things. One is there is sort of an assumption of privacy, I mean, even if it's not private, people might assume that they're not talking to researchers. They're not talking to people who are going to be analyzing their discussions, right? So, you know, I would be careful around anonymizing data that you do collect, and you know, also just being careful about who has access to the data, even though it's public. It hasn't been compiled in the way that you've compiled it, right? So you might be studying something sensitive, and it could be useful. It could be difficult if the data set as you collected it gets out. Does this make sense? And the other thing is around contacting the folks that you're studying, the content that you're studying. So it's very easy to send a tweet to a person whose tweet you just read. Don't do that. That's it. If that's not covered in your IRB protocol around contacting the folks in your study, you can't do that, right? Because that's a different level of interaction with participants. If you're going from public data to now you're interacting with human subjects. So you have to be very careful about how you go about proceeding with, especially research on social media, because it's so easy to interact with, but you can't unless you're following a certain protocol.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. And Robert, what do you think? Please let us know.
Yeah, so I think again it's going to depend on the nature of the task. So you know, the ethical considerations are probably going to be more in line with like what types of manipulations you are doing to subjects. Because I don't think the format really is much different. And in fact, like if you're doing an online study where you're not just posting on a web browser and you never even interact with the subject, you know, they may be more comfortable and more likely to disclose more sensitive information to you than they otherwise would be. So you just have to be careful about what you do with the data you collect. You know, take into consideration the things you normally would, maintaining confidentiality of the data. With some of these approaches, it's easy to maybe even keep data anonymous because you don't have to record any identifying information at all in the database where you're storing the data. So that's, you know, one way that helps. But yeah, just be an ethical researcher, I guess, and take the same considerations you take in the lab with the subject you have online, and maybe put a little bit more effort into debriefing online because you're not going to be physically present to answer questions of subject. So if you're doing a task that is could cause any kind of emotional distress, you should be providing, you know, subjects with some kind of resources to address any issues that could arise from the study that you would physically give them if they were present in front of you. So just take the extra effort to make sure that the briefing experience is, you know, the same as what they would get in the lab.
Seems like a lot of the advice is universal, whether we're doing online research or not, especially as it relates to ethics. Key point, be ethical. Don't stop. So with that, unfortunately, we have to stop this webinar, but I want to thank so much Robert Ariel, Elise Rice, and Joshua Van Arsdale. Thank you so much for your time and your kind contributions. Very valuable conversation we had today. Again, this was recorded. You'll be able to get an email about where you can access it. It'll be on psychologicalscience.org/webinars. And stay tuned, October 15, Path to Postdoc. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Guess we're just all leaving. Bye. How are you doing, Josh?